Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
I'm with Rama Bijapurkar, a recognized thought leader in the consumer economy space as well as market strategy. Ms. Bijapurkar, welcome to The Print.
Thank you for having me.
We are right in the middle of the COVID pandemic, and you've written quite a bit substantially for a lot of newspapers, magazines. You run a think tank, so you base your writing on the back of data. And I have 2 or 3 questions. The first is about what the consumer economy means, especially now that we're in the middle of this crisis. And second of all, in your view, as India deals with this crisis, what does brand India mean to you?
Yeah, as usual, never easy questions. The consumer economy, as you know, most of India's, more than half of India's GDP is driven on the back of what you, I, and every one of our fellow Indians consumes. It is 50 to 60% of our total GDP is accounted for by what we call household consumption. So this really, a lot of people sort of tend to think about it like it's some macro data, like it's made of some big macro magic fingers. But actually, it's about how all of us are feeling. It's about how much we're earning. It's about how much we choose to spend, how confident we feel about spending. So it's really the human face of that 50 to 60% of GDP, the people view of India's economy, as I call it, that I really obsess about. Similarly, if you look at companies, the revenue numbers that everybody touts is really about people who are choosing to spend or not spend, companies who are choosing to spend or not spend. So it's really the human face of this whole thing that I spend my time thinking about, writing about, and researching.
But when you say the human face, or you say the people's view of the economy, I mean, who are the people? We are 1.3 billion people.
Yes.
So when in terms of consumption expenditure, that perhaps could be one indicator. But in your view, who are the people?
So that's an absolutely good question, because we are 281 million households actually, and everyone knows the stunning demographics of rural and urban and everything. But India is, as you know, a land of contradictions. So there are some people who are what I call anywhere in the world, people who just happen to be living in India. And there are a lot of people who India does house a certainly good share of the world's rich, if you look at any of the Forbes listings and so on, but it also hosts a substantial amount of the world's poor. So it is this mixed bag of all of us. And if you arrange them, depending on how rich they are, you will find that there is a small top 20% that we like to call the middle class, which is actually not a very honest term. It is actually the upper class. And then there are people all the way down to our migrant brothers and sisters, migrant labor brothers and sisters we see, who actually don't even earn 10,000 rupees a month in the village and therefore come to the city looking for a better job. These are also less than 10%, you will be surprised to know, is really people who get a regular salary. The rest of India doesn't get a regular salary. So when banks tell me that the salaried class is who they target, I'm thinking, don't you even want the rest of the world? Again, as you know, large companies are very small in number. A lot of the firms are really small and medium. So it really, the people's view of the economy, if there's a one line for it, it is we're a large economy made up of lots and lots and lots of very, very modest income people. When I tell people that the average income, and there are always income wars that erupt, or do they earn so much, do they earn so little? And I wonder, where do these numbers come from? Because when you do, and income surveys are expensive, when you do income surveys, you will find that even the richest 20% in India are actually below America's poverty line. So we really are not as rich as we would like to believe. So a large amount of India earns about 10,000 rupees a month. In fact, if you take household disposable income, which is a number the government puts out, you divide it by the number of households, you get less than about 8 lakhs of rupees a year. So therefore, that is the reality. It's just lots and lots of modest income people who are consuming a little bit each. That adds up to a lot. It's little drops of ocean, little drops of water, little grains of sand. It's that.
In a pandemic like this, or in a crisis like this, how does brand Modi deal with brand India, where you just said that the bottom 40% of the population actually has no surplus income at all.
Yes.
So, I mean, a lot of things are coming together, aren't they?
Yes, they are. A lot of things are coming together, and these are not good times. And I would take away the word brand, because brand India or brand Modi or brand anything. A brand is merely the talking of your walk. So how does Modi deal with India? I don't know. I'm going to reach Shekhar Gupta and figure that out in terms of how he should or how he will. But it is a fact that historically, in fact, if anything, now I think we're beginning to acknowledge. Otherwise, it was very hard, and I spend a lot of time around corporate boardrooms as well. It is very hard to get people to acknowledge that we are as poor as we actually are. And I think that we like to believe that because we're the third largest consumer of TV sets, of everything, a small percentage of a large number is a large number. And India is the third largest after America and China on practically everything. So I think to actually understand that this great and glorious, and that's what we've been writing about, that this great and glorious consumption story of India is actually made up of a whole lot of people who earn very modest amounts and who spend very modest amounts that adds up to a lot. I think it took a migrant crisis for a migrant worker labor crisis for people to understand what the census told us in 2010, that a quarter of urban India are slums. So that it is a surprises me, because I think we've been seeing this data. We know this data. We know the informal economy is telling us that only 6% or 8%, whichever way you look at it, is actually formal. We track, do you get a day off in a week and do you get an appointment letter? And I'm heartbroken when I see the numbers of that. So we already knew what we knew. And I think the direction in which we're going, we have to continue to go in order to be able to just create jobs. And, we're never going to be able to create that many formal jobs, but at least if we can get the wheels of the economy going. So for example, in India, if you have a bad economy, then everybody takes a proportional haircut. The truck doesn't move, the truck driver, the truck owner, the dhaba cleaner, Chotu who brings water to the driver, everybody, you, I, we all take haircuts. So that is the way it is.
Right. But explain to me, how does this then cohere with consumption expenditure? If 40% of your population is really poor and like you said, if you don't have the money, you don't have anything else. You can't do anything else. But if you are that poor, then how do you connect with, sort of consumption levels? How can you improve consumption levels? How can you sort of ramp up your consumption economy?
Firstly, let me take the last question first, or let me take the first question first. This is actually India's law of numbers. It is if you take 5,000 rupees per household into 281 million and you do the math, and I just did it recently, it is so many times greater than the top 100 companies turnover in this country. It just is a lot of people consuming a little bit each that adds up to a lot. If you actually look at the numbers, if you say you're a $2.9 trillion economy or wherever the exchange rate is taking you now, and then household disposable income is about 60% of that. And if you divide that by the number of households, it is what it is. So the large economy is made up of a lot of people consuming a little bit each. It's like Dr. Kurian, this absolutely amazing man who had Operation Flood. He once got very irritated with the Consul General of a smaller country who was pushing him. And he said, "You're such a small country." He said, "If all we Indians stood in a row," this is an apocryphal story maybe, but it's an oft-told story, "and if each of us spits once, we will drown your island." So I think that's it. If every one of us went out, and that is true of COVID as well, it is true of everything. I mean, if everybody just even contacted one or two people, your possibilities of exponential spreading are that many. That is actually, there's only one thing we need to know, that is the essential nature of India's economy. It's a large collection of a lot of people who have informal jobs, who earn a little bit at a time, who spend a little bit at a time, and it all adds up. Contrast that with a lot of big companies. Nobody, with the exception of a few, the Jios, the Airtels, the Hindustan Levers, and so on, are really even deeply penetrated in the entire length and breadth of the households.
So two questions from that, Rama. The first is, what is consumption? When you say that 40% of the people are poor and the 20% are in this sort of rich category or middle class, and the middling is an aspiration.
Middle India, yes.
What are your indicators? Is it like a roti kapda makan type of indicator?
Yeah, so we actually look at routine expenditure, which is your roti, kapda, makan. There is mobile. In fact, the four big categories are conveyance, communication, other than food. And as you go richer, you spend a smaller and smaller proportion of your income on food. As you go poorer, you spend a larger and larger proportion of your income on food. But even in all of rural India, you will find rural India houses half of India is rich and almost all of India is poor. Most of India is poor. So even if you look at rural India, you will find that about half of the total expenditure is on food. The balance is on it's on roti, it's on kapra, it's on makan, it's on education, it's on health, it's on the non-routine expenditure, social ceremonies, unplanned health, capitation fees. So it's conveyance, communication, education. That's really where the categories are.
So what are when you go to these corporate boardrooms, what do people say?
I think firstly, companies have a right to pick who they want to serve. And I think many companies make the choice and say that the top 20% of India, which has about half of India's income, maybe a little less, is nice. So think about the country and you say, that is my India. And my India is growing. My India is rich enough. My India is all these smart kids who are buying iPad minis now because colleges are going online.
Right.
And that is my India. I will serve that India and I will profit from that India and I'm fine. Many of them actually say that. I think that is a choice.
Nothing wrong with it. Like, we should.
That is a choice of strategy. I mean, as people often say to me, and I wear two hats, as people say to me that as my strategy consultant, what would you advise? And I'm saying as your strategy consultant, if you have clarity on who you're going to serve, clarity on how you're going to serve, and you follow that faithfully and profit from it, I have absolutely no problem with that. But it is also true now when all this noise about banks not lending, if the bigger banks, and I'm not saying it is, let me caveat that, I have to be careful what I say to keep it factual. If a lot of the bigger banks, which are not private sector banks, are saying that, I'm sorry, I will only serve the salaried class. I will only serve people, SMEs that are able to give me the collateral that I require. I will only serve those who I believe are worthy of credit cards and who have regular salaries and can show it to me. Then who's going to serve the rest of the country? That is my question. If we didn't have the public sector of banks, I don't believe we would have had even the amount of rural spread that we did.
So do you ask these corporates that in these boardrooms that these guys, the men and women that you meet, do you ask them these questions?
Yeah, we do. We do talk about why are you not serving the rest of the consumer base, and they tell you what the economics of it are. And I'm saying that as from a strategic point of view, I think and they say that we try and get them to serve it in different ways. So some people say that, look, we're not serving the end consumer directly who's poor, but we're serving the ecosystem that helps serve the end consumer. The businesses that are close to my heart are businesses that have actually found the magic model. See, the reason these customers they don't want to serve is that because you have to get your costs right. These consumers are not willing to take yesterday's product. The Indian consumer is what I call the monster consumer. I want the moon and I want it for 6 pence. And you have to figure out how to do it. And people have done it. If you take Nokia in its heyday, you find that even a 3,000 rupee phone actually came slim, sleek. They didn't say you have to buy a phone as big as a house if you're poor and you get a sleek phone if you're rich. And you actually got a camera added on, right? If you look at the National Payment Corporation of India, it's created state-of-the-art products like UPI, which are, with some government nudge, free to use.
Right.
If you look at the Jan Dhan business where everybody got pushed into actually giving everybody bank accounts, I think that actually came quite poor. So we, so to profit, and this was really C.K. Prahlad's original thesis, which is there fortune at the bottom of the pyramid? And I know that he came into a lot of flack for that. I once did a conference with people from the corporate sector, the non-corporate sector, and we spent all morning fighting over Fortune was not right, we changed it to progress. Bottom was not right, we changed it to base. So progress at the base of the pyramid was something everybody was happy with. Progress does involve goods and services and products, and that's what we actually need. So if you're poor in India today, you're still buying water, you're still buying electricity. Ironically, you're still buying education because you're moving your kids into small private schools. So actually, the lower income and the modest income gets more rights as a consumer right now than it does as a citizen, because we have a spectacular failure of public goods. But going back to your boardroom question, there are some strategic choices companies make. There are some licenses. If you're a microfinance company, if you're a small finance bank, if you're I mean, the ubiquitousness of telecom has obviously been driven by the private sector. So some choose, some don't. Many multinationals don't. In between, a lot of large Indian businesses decided they were going to go abroad and buy companies. Then that picnic got over. So slowly, I think there are a whole new breed now of startups who are ready to serve because they have the cost position, because they're digital. They are ready to serve people in the lower income groups. But I call this, and you can delete it if it is not, it isn't exactly politically correct. But the best way to describe this phenomenon is, when you can kiss the mistress, why kiss the maid? Or the other way around.
Now, say that again. I didn't get that. That the best way to describe it is?
When you can kiss the mistress, why kiss the maid? Though I'm told it's the other way around, but either way. But maybe a more politically correct way to think about it is the frog prince. When you can kiss the prince, which is the top 20%, the celebrated middle class, why kiss the frog that may turn out to be a prince and may actually turn out to give you some really...
Or may not.
Yeah. Or may not. It may send you to bankruptcy, right?
Yeah.
There is fortune at the bottom of the pyramid because a lot of consumption expenditure sits at the bottom of the pyramid. But can corporates get their fingers on it with the appropriate business model and profit from it? That's been this holy grail, the struggle so far, and the jury's still out.
That's fascinating because, I'm sure they're all reading Deng Xiaoping, who said to get rich is glorious. But I have another question for you, and I've been reading, some of your stuff, and this really struck me from the survey that you guys did, the ICE survey, which is that 90 million people are dependent on casual labor. I mean, that was a statistic that was horrifying, actually, at some level. And you put this in the red category, which is that they're at huge risk.
Yes.
How would you explain that?
How would I explain that there are that many people or that they're at risk? I think the occupation, okay, let's look back. I think so far the whole discourse on consumption in this country has just bypassed occupation. No one wants to know how we earn, and how we earn determines how we spend, right? You can't have consumption if you don't have income. I mean, that's a simple truth.
Right.
But the uncomfortableness, so we call it formal and informal, because that describes the supply side of the employer, but we don't really, we don't put front and center the fact that I have been writing about this for a while to say we're building, but we're building a little bit on shifting sand. Now, what this has shown, and I've been obsessed with occupation, so we finally put out occupation data to say, this is the occupation and this is the amount of consumption. So the interesting thing is that the casual labor and the street vendors and the petty hawkers and so on account for over 23% of our total consumption expenditure. There are lots of people are spending a little bit each. So I put it in red because what we did was we said if there's a risk map of consumption, let's start with occupation. And the casual labor has been most hit. They've had to go back to their home states. There is no retained earning of any kind. They've probably not been paid, because if you don't show up for work because there's no work, then you don't get paid. So, clearly to sit down and say, that was actually in response to people who say to me, so how is consumption going to do? And I'm saying, how can consumption do anything when so many people don't have incomes to have? Right? Your street vendor can't vend, and so on and so forth. And a lot of companies, so far, I don't think we've seen a lot of layoffs, but going forward, we might, right? You and I may have paid our domestic staff, which is another large number. So they appear to be salaried, but in actual fact, they may or may not get paid, depending on whether people choose to pay them or not.
Right.
So half of India's consumption comes from people. Half of India's consumption expenditure, which drives half of India's GDP, comes from people who have to show up every day somewhere for the ability to earn a daily bread. And that's why if you're poor, the consumption is meant, I mean, the dharma of business is meant to add value to your life and extract value from you. And that is really what consumption is meant to do. A mobile phone is a productivity tool, which is why everybody buys the mobile phone, not because of anything else. The two-wheeler is a productivity tool, right? Packaged food and glucose biscuits that you give your child augments the really bad milk you're giving your child. So it's not about hair grips and salons alone. And why not? If that makes you feel more confident at work, why not?
No, but I love the line that you just said, that the dharma of business is to extract value and to
add value first and extract value next.
Yeah, I think that was beautiful. But you know, in one of the articles that you wrote, and I'm just going to stay with a casual labor question, where you said that if 90 million people are in this category, then you would say that the government would perhaps need 1.6 lakh crores, which is just under 1% of the GDP, to be able to give them some sort of support.
Yeah.
Now, this data is from the 2016 survey that the LCE survey. But I'm asking that, you know, right now in these COVID times where we've seen this huge migrant labor crisis, and perhaps that has only underlined and aggravated just that figure and the whole statement.
Yeah.
The government has given quite a bit of money. In fact, perhaps given the an equivalent amount that you talk about, which is 1.6 lakh crores, is perhaps a little bit over that.
Mm-hmm.
So, isn't the government responding to this crisis then?
Yeah. So two things. I think, of course, the government is responding to the crisis. It's how it's responding that is actually open to debate. And even the print had actually asked, is this the best way? Should you put money directly into people's hands or not? I'm a little worried that every economist is going to kill me because I am not an economist. But let me tell you what I'm thinking on this. At the time when this article was written, we said from ground up, let's just do the numbers and see. And so it would really be that for every month of lockdown, you actually need to put 2 months of salary into people's hands. In some cases, we said if you're a petty trader, let's give you a month of income so that 15 days can go into 15. This was actually written, I think, about, literally a month into the crisis. Yeah. So we calculated for various people and we said, if you're better off, then you don't actually need to do this. If you have an employer, then maybe the government should prevail on your employer to pay. So if you were to look at 3 months of lockdown, we're really talking about 3 times that amount of money in direct money to just survive, which hasn't happened. The other thing is that the punt right now, as I understand, is being taken. So people say, why don't you put more money into people's hands to stimulate consumption? And I'm saying that's the wrong end of the stick. Please put money into people's hands so that they can survive, so that they can live, so that they can get back on their feet and they can start their lives again. That's what it is, so that they can feed their children and do whatever it is that has to be done. So it is really income support. Stimulating consumption, my point of view has been even before this, that the reason people say if you stimulate consumption, then businesses will invest. My own view is that a lot of corporate India is not in a position to invest in any case, because at that time we went through the jails, the bankruptcies, the NPAs, the various other problems. So if you keep giving glucose shots to weak bodies, it's not going to get up and run.
Right.
So you have to fix the business side of it and get businesses going again in whatever form. And for businesses to say we're not confident about the consumption strength of this economy is really not fair, because it doesn't get better than this anywhere else. Mm-hmm. But finally, the point is that policy is about the values of a society. So how would I cohere it all? I'm saying that what are the values of the society? The society, if we value fairness, then I think that those who are unfair in their practices with public money must be brought to book. I mean, I'm saying that, okay, I don't have stake shareholding to lose. I don't have a lot of other stuff to lose, but I'm saying that if the process of cleaning up is going to cause ripples and waves and is going to be like the bushfire that cleans out a lot of the jungle at great pain, it has to be done. As far as the lower end of the income pyramid is concerned, I think I have absolutely no issues whatsoever with what people call handout and populism. And I'm saying no. Agriculture, for example, by definition, you are spending more than you earn. and farming will always have to be subsidized if we want food security. So if we stick to the debate of what kind of values do we want as a society, I think we're fairly clear. And I think it was Prime Minister Manmohan Singh actually who put the word inclusion into our agenda, into our discourse, into our vocabulary, into our discourse. And I think now nobody objects to the fact that if growth is not inclusive, then it's bad growth. Right? So similarly, if it is not fair, if there is abuse of public money, then there is abuse of public money. And if you, I mean, I remember one of the ministers, I forget whom, many years ago, who said around the time when the loan write-off happened to farmers, and he said in a public function that if you have written off X amount of money, 60,000 crores to farmers, and you complain, he said, take the amount of NPAs in the system, which at that time were 40,000 crores. And he said, divide it by the number of people who are responsible for this 40,000 crores, and you guys really have no reason to complain. So I think it has to come back to saying what values do we want as a society, and that God, GDP is not the only thing. I mean, I think the Amartya Sen and Jean Drèze in their very early book said it right, that the purpose of economic development is so people can live a valuable and valued life. And so I think that is what all of us as stakeholders have to adhere to.
So what did demonetization do?
I'll tell you what it was meant to do, as I understand it, as a citizen of this country. As a citizen of this country, it was meant to throw black money out of the system and to extinguish it and throw it in the Ganga. From everything that I've read of what happened, it did not get extinguished and thrown in the Ganga. One view is it came back into the banks, and so it has increased bank lending. The other view is that it was just a lot of spinning wheels with lots of damage that actually achieved nothing. So there is the intent, and there is the implementation of it as well, right?
Yeah, because that's one of the harsh or draconian measures that you talked about. But how did
GST, for example, is forcing formalization to a great extent. But it is also true that with GST, which everybody is lauding, that the consumer is paying more. I'm paying more. I'm paying 18% for my internet. I'm paying for everything. Large companies have actually had their margins expand a little more because they're getting offsets. Small guys who are not part of the formal chain have a problem. But as a Jugaadu society, we're even trying to jugaad the returns of GST. Apparently, there are lots of fraud returns. But at the end of the day, I think that over time, people do come together. I've seen this happen in the digital space. I was on the board of a company called the National Payment Corporation for 8 years. And slowly, we've actually seen the transition to a digital economy. Today, and also with the whole identity thing. I mean, I remember asking for an LPG gas connection for my household help many years ago. I was told she can't have it because she couldn't produce rent receipt. Her Aadhaar card had home address in the village. Okay, I called the chairman of an oil company, and the chairman said, don't ask me to change petroleum ministry rules. If you want a special connection, I'll get you one. And I was very frustrated. And 8 years later, when for maid number 2, I wanted a connection, I told her, go to your nearest guy, show him your Aadhaar card, tell him you want a gas connection. She got it in 10 days. So
and yet the Aadhaar card did not really work during this migrant crisis. People.
Yes, because they're now talking, but I think it has exposed as people say, it's exposed the fault line. So when you're talking about portability of benefits, I think that's a good conversation to have. So I think in some senses, it has ripped from our eyes the convenient seeing that we all did of the economy. I mean, it's like the proverbial elephant. We only saw the bits that we wanted to see. But I think this has sadly sort of shown us that we knew what it was. I mean, 2010 census told us that a quarter of all housing in urban areas can be notified as slums. And we know how terribly people were living. And the other thing I also don't get is when people say, well, why are the migrants going back home? I mean, the same reason our kids have come back from America, right?
That's right. Absolutely.
I mean, as the chap who works with me said, यहाँ मरेगा तो वहाँ कोई देखने को नहीं आएगा, वहाँ मरेगा तो यहाँ कोई देखने को नहीं जाएगा.
That's right.
So yeah,
But
it's
do you see a greater empathy? Do you see that this migrant labor crisis has, awakened in all of us some empathy and some compassion for those less fortunate?
Yes, I think so, because I think for every horror story we've heard, we've also seen and heard with our own eyes people who are really taking care of people, people who, all feeding and all the other stuff. But the fundamental question is कि यहाँ तक नौबत कैसे पहुंची? How did it get to this? And I think that's a question we're all asking. How did it get to this? Did it get to this because we had GDP as our god? Did it get to it because we talk of populism and handouts? Did it get to it because politically we wanted to keep the poor poor? I don't know. As a citizen, this is what bothers me
What
and
do you
bothers
think?
me.
What do you think? How did we get to it? Is it because GDPs are God, or did we want to keep
I
the
think
poor poor?
I think after 1991, somewhere along the way, the self-image of a certain part of the country basically was that we had, it's the usual, we're the eighth largest, the great GDP, we're the ones that are growing faster than anybody else, we're this, we're that. So I think somewhere we started benchmarking ourselves relative to others rather than in absolute terms to say, what did our stock market is at this much. If you look at the number of people who are actually in the stock market, who are invested in the stock market, and the stock market went to zero tomorrow, a lot of people would not be affected in this country.
Rama Vijayapurkar, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for speaking to The Print.
Thank you. Thank you.
Please continue to watch us, read us, and tell
Yes,
us what you think.
absolutely. I'm a big fan.